Lieutenant David Keith with New London Police, and I'm going to read you some chapters of Nuts to You. And a little disclaimer here, we are sharing these chapters with permission from the author, Lynn Ray Perkins. So chapter 15, Ill Winds, Chill Winds. When you were in the midst of it, it was the racket. As you got farther away from it, it was the rumbling. One thing you could say about it, it was hard to remember which way to run. As they hurried towards their imperiled home, TTs and Jed tried to warn the creatures of the treetops, mostly the squirrels, but also some birds, chipmunks, what have you, about what was coming their way. At first, animals listened to them. The rumblings had already made them uneasy. They were nervous and jumpy. They were looking for explanations. But the farther the friends traveled, the harder it was to convince anyone. As the rumblings was muffled by foliage and dimmed by distance, it could barely be heard above all the other sounds of the world. How much more urgent could this cold wind rushing in, bringing heavy skies that swallowed up the treetops and let loose drops of icy rain? And when the few stray bits of snow were sighted falling among the raindrops, instinct took over completely. Now squirrels looked blankly at Jed and TTs, not even hearing what they said. Almost to a squirrel, they responded with the same 6 words. Winter is coming, I must gather. Only 2 squirrels along the way actually stopped and listened to their warning. The first was a big burly fellow, old and grizzled. A squirrel who had survived many dangers. He turned black, still shiny-eyed toward them. Someone said this sort of thing before, he said. Was it today? Was it yesterday? I can't be sure. He cocked his head. I can't hear any rumbling. Perhaps you are mistaken. He smiled at them. We saw it, said TTs. We saw it with our own eyes. Gathering is for nuts, said the burly old squirrel with sage air. Scattering is for danger. This is an ancient squirrel saying along the lines of, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But, sputtered TTs, but, come on, TTs, said Jed. Goodbye, sir. When a tree falls in your forest, may the sound of it be distant. This is another ancient squirrel saying. You can probably guess for yourself what it means. Jed said it to be courteous, but he was pretty sure that this time it was not going to be true. The second squirrel who listened was a young reddish female. That's what the other one said, she murmured, more to herself than to them. She spoke with only a faint trace of a reddish accent. The other one? Asked Jed. The squirrels passing through, she said thoughtfully, migrating like geese, like robins, like butterflies, for crying out loud. That's not what squirrels do. Something isn't right. She spoke as if they were thinking aloud. She looked at them, studying as if they held the secret to a puzzle she was trying to solve. A gust of wet wind blew her fur the wrong way, and she wrapped her tail around her shoulders. She held a seed pod close to her breast. It was clear she was fighting the instinct to run with it and hide it. In the middle distance, a grating, gravelly roar rose and fell. The 3 squirrels flinched. It's just like he described, the reddish squirrel, a bone-crunching racket. TTs and Jed exchanged glances. He said bone-crunching racket? Asked TT. What did he look like? Asked Jed. The other squirrel. The other squirrel shrugged. He was grayish, she said, like you. Also, he wore a cap. She patted the top of her head. Also, she added shyly, he was handsome. What kind of cap? Asked TT. Was it an acorn top? Yes, said the squirrel, with a sprig of something on top. Goldenrod, I think. He's alive, then, said Jed to TTs. And he's heading home, said TTs, like us, ahead of us. TTs and Jed embraced. They jumped up and down and spun around. Then, wanting to share their joy, they drew the reddish girl into the circle and spun around again and again. Being squirrels, they were able to manage all of this without falling from the tree. Thank you, shouted TTs as they spun. Thank you for the good news. Then, because even squirrels get dizzy, they sat down. Now, as it was, the world that was spinning, and they laughed, waiting for it to stop, and it did. But the bone-crunching racket crescendoed a little louder, a little closer. Vibrations rippled and buzz through the rumps in their footpads. "We'd better go," said Jed. "Okay," said Tees. "I'm going with you," said the girl squirrel with sudden resolve. Then, more uncertainty, "If that's okay." "It's fine," said Tees, "but what about your family?" "I'm an orphan," she answered, speaking simply and without self-pity. "A solitary. Long story. I'll tell you about it," but indicating with a nod the sound of a shedding tree and the sharp whine that went with it. "I think we better talk while we move." "What do we call you?" asked Jed. This is a tricky name. I gotta look at the reference here. "Chuka is my name," said the squirrel, "but you can call me Chuka." And that's it for chapter 15. Hey guys, it's Lieutenant David Keith again, and I'm going to review chapter 16 of Nuts to You. Once again, a little disclaimer, we are sharing these chapters with permission from Lynn Ray Perkins, the author of Nuts to You. Chapter 16, Chica's Tale. As the three squirrels hurried along, Chica told Jed and Titi her tale. "I was just a pup," she said, "when my mother and my brothers were flattened." Oof. I would have been flattened too, except that I had stopped to eat a tulip. I was still too small to reach most tulips, but this one was tiny and low to the ground. My mother kept saying, "Hurry," but I couldn't help myself. I popped it into my mouth. It was so tasty, but even as I was savoring it, something huge flashed by, and Mama and Buddy. A tear escaped from the corner of her eye. For a moment, it was a perfect crystal sphere on her cheek fur. Then she brushed it away. "Well, I've not been able to eat a tulip since," she said. "And I don't mean to be stupid," said Titi quietly. "But what is a tulip?" "A kind of flower," said Chica. "Really tasty. At least that's how I remember it." "What was it that flashed by?" asked Jed. Chica looked at them, amused. "You haven't lived among humans, have you?" she said. "No," said Jed. "Well, we see them sometimes," said Titi, "but they don't stay. They just pass through." "Well, I grew up among them," said Chica. "Our grove was in one of their colonies. It was all right most of the time. They don't actually come out of their nests at all that often. When they do, they travel inside these big, I don't even know how to explain them to you. Imagine a beetle that is big as just really big. So big the humans crawl inside of them, and then, when you have traveled somewhere, they crawl back out. Undigested. And you better stay out of that beetle's way, because it steps on you," asked Jed. Chica considered she didn't know how to explain wheels. She didn't understand them herself. It would be like getting in the way of a huge boulder rolling down a hill. You would be smashed, flattened. It happens fairly often because they move so fast. You can't get out of their way. They come out of nowhere and bam! "Cricket," said Jed. "It sounds scary," said Titi. "So what do you do?" asked Jed. "Who took care of you?" "I moved into my grandfather's nest," said Chica. "Where was your father?" asked Titi gently. "Raccoon," said Chica, matter-of-factly. "At least that's what I was told. I never knew him. But my grandfather was kind and very wise. He taught me so much. He told me stories. He knew more than any squirrel I've ever met. Of course, he was also very old." "Are squirrels wise because they're old?" mused Jed. "Or old because they're wise?" "That's something you could wonder about all day," laughed Titi. "Probably it works both ways. But even if a squirrel is very, very wise," said Chica, "he can only get so old. As the poem goes, squirrels are fleet and life is fleeting. Gather ye nuts and feast while ye may." This sounds better in squirrel, and it rhymes and it has lots of clicks. "So my grandfather had this idea," she went on. "All his life, he had wanted to see how far he could travel without touching the ground. It was because of ancient stories that tell how a squirrel could once travel from one edge of the world to the other this way. I think it can still be done," he said to me. "We might have to backtrack, look for new paths, but I would like to see the edge of the world for myself, and I would like to get there without touching the ground." Would you like to go with your old grandfather? He asked. He probably was growing foolish in his age, and I was still foolish in my youth. Of course I went. At first it was exciting. It was always a lark to look for a new path to find where none seems possible. But as we traveled, I began to notice that grandfather was faltering. There were jumps that should have been easy, but now he was barely grasping the landing. He chuckled and acted as if it was nothing. But we both knew what was happening. I tried to watch out for him. I tried, I would say, let's take the easy path, or let's stop for today. But there was part of him that could not give up. He really wanted to make it to the edge. I was a little afraid of it. I mean, what if we fell off? What then? I can't even imagine it, said TT's. My brain is not that big. Are you sure there isn't even an edge? I think it's an old-fashioned idea, said Jed. Some squirrels think the forest is endless. Some think it circles back and meets itself. But no one really knows. At least no squirrel has returned to tell us. Well, Cheeky went on, my grandfather wanted to find out, and one day he thought we had found it, the edge, and it really did look like it as if we had. He crept out to the end of the last branch. He waved goodbye, then stepped off into the fog. I waited there for a long time, she said, overnight and into the next day. The fog lifted and I could see far below a river. There was more world on the other side of it. This wasn't the edge, but my grandfather, one way or another, was gone. By this time we had journeyed far from our home. We had taken many winding paths. I backed away from the edge and turned around, but I did not know how to find my way home. Eventually I settled. So that's why I am solitary. But, she said, the story you told of the shredding and scattering, it's a story my grandfather told. He had seen it too. That's why I listened. To the other squirrel and to you. That's why I came along. A good story makes a good journey go by more quickly. A really good story makes you forget you were even on a journey. You don't notice the cold, wet winds that splatter your fur with silver droplets. You don't realize when you step from one branch to another, or even that your feet are moving. You stop noticing with all of your senses the things that you really ought to notice. What sort of things? If you're a squirrel, there's so many kinds of things to watch for. The kind that rumbles in the distance, the kind that follows you stealthily downwind and licks its chops when you pause, the kind that is a dead branch that has been holding to its tree by a few fibrous strands, then fewer strands, then one strand, and then that one strand breaks and the branch falls through there. Watch out! The kind where vapor freezes in the clouds into the small roundest masses of ice that fall, and suddenly, instead of drops of rain or even snow, icy balls the size of walnuts are pelting your pelt. That's the kind happening now. The hungry fox, who had been following the squirrels from below, flinched as his pelt was pelted with ice balls. He forgot his focus on food and scrambled for shelter in a lean-to formed by fallen firs. The squirrels, too, ducked and raced for cover from the hailstones. Jed and Chica flattened themselves against what they hoped was the safer side of a tree trunk. Then they heard TT shout, "Here, up here!" They looked up and saw her head poking out from the hollow in the tree. Quickly, they climbed up and crawled in beside her. Together they watched the wintry mix of drops and flakes and hailstones fly willy-nilly down from the heavens. It was a good time to stay put. It was a lousy time to try to convince anyone to move. They didn't even want to move their own selves out of a small shelter they had found. The view outside the knothole was the opposite of a fireplace, but it was just hypnotic. Huddled together for warmth, they watched the storm rage, transfixed. The light of the day, already dimmed by the thick, heavy clouds, faded further to black. The wild song of the wind, muffled by the curved walls around them, lullabied the three squirrels to sleep. Hey guys, it's Lieutenant David Keith again, and I'm reading you Chapter 17 of Nuts to You. And just another disclaimer, we're sharing these chapters with the permission from the author, Lynn Ray Perkins. Chapter 17, Bobcats Happen. Afternoon darkened into evening. The air grew colder. It grew mean and spiteful, gathering its forces and hurling drops of slushy flakes and icy pellets at Chai. He turned his back to the winds and rubbed his face. Night was falling. He could not keep going, especially in this weather. He was tired. He was cranky. He was forgetting to be careful. He made his way to the ground in the way that you might make your way from the living room to your bedroom. He dragged leaves and bits of brush into a lazy heap in the way you might arrange the covers you left in such a mess this morning. This is fine for you. There are probably no bobcats lurking in the bathroom, waiting to pounce on you as you pass by. The bobcat may have been tired and cranky, too. That's why he carelessly snapped a twig as he moved closer to the tasty snack that he had suddenly come into view. Chai's fur stood on end. He sniffed the air. He felt the presence of the big cat. Fear gave him one last burst of energy, and he took off, his paws barely meeting the ground. Aware of nothing but the need to hide, he frantically scanned the murkiness ahead. Was that a crevice? It was. Hallelujah, he went in. It was narrow, not too deep, but deep enough. Deeper than the length of a bobcat's arm. He flattened his back against the wall and pulled in his gut. Almost immediately, bobcat claws reached in, exploring. Chai felt the pointy tips graze his fur hairs, but he did not move. He did not breathe or make one sound. The bobcat withdrew his paw and sniffed at the opening of the crevice. Satisfied that the snack was still in there, the bobcat lay down. The fact that the crevice was in the entry to a small cave was a piece of good luck for him. Sheltered from the storm, he settled in. There was a little empty place in his stomach that he wouldn't mind filling, but he wasn't in a hurry. He could wait. His eyes, sucked in the last shreds of light from the stormy evening, had to offer and reflected back into the darkness. They appeared to Chai as faint yellow spheres with a large black bobcat shape. It was hard for him to separate the bobcat from the general darkness, except that the cat was darker and closer and warmer. He could smell its scent. He could feel its warm breath waft over him in the waves when the bobcat exhaled. It was an odd feeling to be somewhat grateful for that warmth on this bone-chilling night, knowing all the while that if he emerged even slightly from the crevice, the warmth would envelope him and become even warmer in a moist, painful, fatal way. The thought gave him pause, or rather, pause. Haha. He smiled weakly at his little joke. The situation was not funny at all, though. In the chill between the bobcat breaths, Chai shuddered. He looked out at the yellow eyes, and in the black shape, he felt a warm breath. He was hungrier than the bobcat was. He was on the verge of fainting from hunger. Mixed with terror, after a time he slumped, not so much falling asleep as collapsing. It was as if his body said, "This is the end. I'd rather not know about it." Still pressed against the wall, the bottom parts of him slid out, away from it, just a little, within reach of the bobcat, although he wasn't paying attention just then. And that, friends, is chapter 17. Oh, hey kids, it's Lieutenant David Keith again with New London Police, reading chapter 18 of Nuts to You. And as our disclaimer again, we are sharing these chapters with the permission of the author, Linda Ray Perkins. Chapter 18, Something Was Different. For hours the storm blustered and banged outside the tree where TT's Jed and Cheeky slept. The very same storm slammed and walloped around the cave where Chai had collapsed in the cold crevice. It hollowed and pelted, whirled and whined. It spit and sprayed and showered. Its winds were fierce, its wetness was inescapable. Every living thing caught out in the icy furry, curled in on itself, shivered, shriveled, and shrank. And then, while everyone else's eyes were squeezed shut, the storm rattled and whimpered and spun its way to somewhere else. The air stilled, the stars emerged. In the crevice, Chai opened his eyes and blinked. He sensed that something was different. Something had changed. He realized that the bottom of him had slid within reach of the bobcat's claws. Stealthily, moving one paw at a time, he worked his way back up to a standing position. The rock wall behind him was wicked cold. Not the sort of thing you wanted to nestle up to, given the choice, but nestle up he did. By the time he was on his feet again, he had adjusted to the darkness, and Chai noticed two things. One was that the darkness wasn't so dark. The form of the bobcat was edged by moonlight. He could make out easily the peaceful rising and falling of the bobcat's furry ribs. Also, the noise of the storm had subsided. He could still hear the sound of moving air, but now the air was moving in and out from the bobcat's nose. The bobcat was snoring, which meant the bobcat was asleep. Since bobcats are creatures who hunt by night, he knew that the bobcat was just napping, so it might be now or never. Chai saw that. Still, to run towards the mouth and claws of the bobcat went against everything that was in him. He moved closer, paused, listened. Should he go on? He waited for the next snore, and waited, and waited. Chai glanced back to see how far he had come from the relative safety of the wall. As he did, the snore came, a loud ripping one, and he jumped. There was a halt in the middle of the snore, and he froze. Then the rest of the snore, a soft, trailing, farting wheeze. Fear left him. He stepped out of the crevice, and he paddled right up to the sleeping beast and stood up. He looked it over. He had never seen one of these up close before. He thumbed his nose at the bobcat. He put up his thumbs in his ears and wiggled his fingers. He turned his back and lifted his tail and mooned the big animal, mooning in the moonlight. Then he stepped softly toward the nearest tree and scurried up and away, not because he was afraid, but because he was not a fool. Bobcats, of course, climb trees too. They are excellent climbers, but sleeping bobcats don't. This bobcat was only napping, and momentarily he opened his eyes and blinked. He sensed that something was different. Something